The day my brother called me unprofessional, the glass walls of Donovan Industries turned into a mirror I couldn't escape. His hand slammed against the conference table, my papers scattering like they didn't matter, and laughter rippled around the room. Everyone saw me as the weak Donovan, the mistake. But they didn't know I had been writing everything down, that every insult, every smirk was becoming evidence. And one day those notes would speak louder than his power. That's how my story inside Donovan Industries began. Not with triumph, but with silence, sharpened into resolve. They call this place Donovan Industries, a family empire polished to a shine for the outside world. But for me, every step through these sterile hallways feels heavy, like I am dragging chains no one else can see. The fluorescent lights above cast a harsh white glow on the polished stone floors. Each reflection, each glance from a passing colleague reminds me of what they think I am: a shadow, an afterthought, someone who does not belong. That morning, the conference room smelled faintly of coffee and anxiety. The long glass walls trapped the silence, amplifying every sound. My brother David sat at the head of the table, his tie perfectly knotted, his posture radiating authority. He was the golden son of Donovan Industries, the heir apparent, the one everyone bowed their heads to. I took my place near the end of the table, careful not to draw attention. I had prepared my notes the night before, reviewing every line until my eyes ached. Still, as the meeting began, I felt the weight of eyes sliding over me, dismissing me before I even opened my mouth. David's voice cut through the room like a blade. "Claire," he said, tapping his pen against the table, his tone deceptively calm. "You're supposed to have the projections ready." I straightened my papers, my palms damp. "Yes, I have them." The rest of my sentence never made it out. David's palm slammed against the glass table with a crack that made the entire room flinch. Keyboards stopped clattering. A coffee cup trembled on its saucer. Several pairs of eyes flicked toward me, then quickly away, as though my humiliation were contagious. "You are too slow," David barked, jabbing a finger in my direction. "Always behind. Always fumbling. We don't need someone unprofessional dragging down this project." The word hung in the air, echoing against the glass walls. Unprofessional. A few awkward chuckles broke the silence, brittle and forced. I felt the heat crawl up my neck, searing my cheeks while the rest of me went numb. It was as if I had been stripped bare in front of them, every flaw magnified under the unforgiving light. I lowered my eyes to the table, swallowing the knot in my throat. My nails dug into my palms beneath the desk. Outwardly, I was silent, compliant, the picture of a scolded employee. Inside, something else burned. They all thought I was just another Donovan pushed to the margins, too weak, too incompetent to matter. But the truth was quieter, harder to see. My presence here was not entirely without reason. Though no one spoke it aloud, I sensed that the chairman, the father who had built this empire, still watched from the shadows. He gave no public endorsement, no shield against my brother's cruelty. Yet he had let me remain. And I understood what that silence meant. I was not here to shine beside David, not yet. I was here to endure, to observe, to keep record of what others ignored. One day, when the moment arrived, those records would carry a weight greater than anyone in this room imagined. The meeting dragged on, with David commanding the room as if nothing had happened, as if crushing me were just part of the agenda. When it ended, chairs scraped back, and people hurried out, conversations resuming like nothing had occurred. No one looked directly at me. Shame, it seemed, was invisible, but heavy enough to bend their spines away from mine. I walked back to my small desk, every step echoing in my head. I pulled open the drawer and retrieved the black leather notebook I had carried with me since the first day I walked into Donovan Industries. My hand trembled as I uncapped my pen. The first lines wavered across the page, shaky and uneven, mirroring the tremor in my hand. David called me unprofessional in front of the team. Laughter from the others. I swallowed it. I paused, staring at the words. For a moment, I almost tore the page out, almost crumpled it and threw it away as I had done countless times before in my life. But then I pressed the pen harder against the paper, my strokes growing sharper, cleaner. The ink cut into the page like a blade carving into stone. Every insult, Every sideways glance, every smirk, I etched them down one by one. Each word was no longer just a wound. It became evidence. My chest rose and fell as I closed the notebook, my fingertips lingering on the worn leather cover. My reflection stared back at me from the dark surface of the desk, eyes red-faced tight, but not broken. They thought I was weak. They thought silence meant surrender. They thought humiliation would bury me. But I had begun to understand something different. Silence can sharpen into a weapon. And this notebook filled with their careless cruelty would one day matter more than any of them realized. I slid it back into the drawer, locking it with a quiet click. They think I will stay small, voiceless, I whispered to myself, the words tasting strange, powerful, dangerous. But I knew the truth. Every line in that notebook was another step toward the reckoning no one in this building saw coming. And when the time was right, those words would no longer be ink, they would be fired. The next morning I walked into Donovan Industries with a smile that felt glued to my face. The polished glass walls threw back my reflection, distorted and out of place, as though even the building itself rejected me. Whispers leaked down the hallway like smoke. Eyes flicked past me, sharp and quick, carrying the same unspoken verdict, she is nothing. I clutched my folder, tighter, nails pressing into the cardboard. I had spent the past week preparing for the morning report. My figures were precise, my analysis meticulous. I had rehearsed until my throat ached, determined that this time I would prove I belonged here. The boardroom was already half full. Executives in crisp suits scrolled through their tablets, murmuring to one another. I took my seat at the end, my heart pounding, but my voice steady in my head. When the meeting began, I opened my notes, and started to present. Based on last quarter's revenue stream, I began forcing my tone to remain calm. We project a 15% increase if we enough. David's voice sliced through mine. The room stilled. He leaned back in his chair, lips curved in a practiced smirk. "Let's save everyone's time," he said, his eyes fixed on me, but his words meant for the others. "My sister is still learning what professionalism looks like. I'll handle this." He gestured toward the screen as though my presence were an inconvenience, a distraction. Soft laughter rippled around the table. Not loud, not cruel, but sharp enough to cut. I felt the heat rush to my face, a flush I could not control. Beneath the table, my hands locked together, nails biting into my skin to stop them from trembling. David clicked the remote, and my slides vanished, replaced by his. The plan I had spent nights perfecting dissolved from the screen as though it had never existed. I sank back into my chair, my stomach hollow. I was being erased in real time. But shadows cannot be erased. What David didn't know was that I had already copied every file he had touched. I had seen the changes, the red flags, columns that didn't add up, expenses that ballooned without explanation, data trimmed just enough to make the picture prettier than reality. The rest of the meeting blurred. People nodded, jotted notes, and laughed at David's dry jokes. My slides, my voice, my work, all forgotten. But in my mind, each second was etched deep. His smirk, the chuckles, the silence that followed. Evidence, all of it. That night I shut myself in the small apartment I called home. I bolted the door, pulled the blinds tight. The glow of the laptop illuminated my face as I opened the copied files. Rows of numbers filled the screen, endless and indifferent. I scrolled line by line, my breath catching as the patterns emerged. A payment that didn't align. A contract missing a clause. Inflated figures dressed as legitimate growth. These weren't mistakes. They were deliberate. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. My fingers moved quickly, dragging the files onto a portable drive. The click of the transfer echoed louder than it should have, like a gavel striking. When the final file landed in place, I pulled the drive free and held it in my palm. My heart pounded, a mix of fear and exhilaration. This was more than humiliation now. This was leverage. I crossed the room and slid the drive into the back of my closet beneath a stack of folded clothes. My hands lingered there, pressing it down as though burying something alive. I sat on the edge of the bed, my body trembling. I whispered into the dark, daring myself to believe it. They think I am a shadow. But shadows see everything. Shadows remember. And tonight, I had taken the first piece of the puzzle that could expose the truth. I live in two worlds now. By day, I was Claire, the overlooked assistant the girl brushed aside in meetings, the one no one trusted with anything that mattered. But when night fell, I became something else. A watcher. A shadow patient enough to gather every careless word, every number David bent until it broke every scrap of paper others left behind. In the office, humiliation took new shapes. No longer just his sharp words cutting across the boardroom, but whispers curling through the hallways. I would walk past a group of colleagues, and their voices would drop, laughter leaking out after I passed. They repeated David's favorite line, "Unprofessional," as if it were my name. Sometimes I caught fragments, "She only has that job because of her last name." Or worse, "He keeps her around out of pity." The words never reached me directly, but they were meant for me all the same. During the endless meetings, I sat at the far end of the table, pen in hand, eyes lowered. To anyone watching, I looked like the dutiful sister scribbling notes no one would ever read. But my pages told a different story. Every boast David made, every clever spin of data that earned approving nods from the directors, I carved it down in ink, exact and cold. The boardroom was his theater, but I was writing the script behind the curtain. When the room emptied, I lingered. I shuffled papers together, smiling faintly as though tidying up. In truth, my eyes darted across abandoned handouts, discarded drafts. A contract signed too quickly. A spreadsheet clipped at the margins. I slipped them into my folder, my movements calm, almost casual. To anyone else, invisible. To me, each page was a weapon. One night I sat alone in my apartment, the glow of my laptop spilling over the desk. I copied files, organized them into folders. My hands trembling not from fear, but from the weight of what I was uncovering. I was so focused that I didn't hear the door creak open. "Claire," I froze. My heart slammed against my ribs as I turned. Sarah stood there, her slim frame half hidden in the doorway. She was the youngest in our department, often sent on errands no one else wanted. I had watched David snap at her, dismiss her work, send her scurrying for coffee like a servant. Now she was staring at me, eyes wide, lips pressed tight. I slammed the laptop shut, too late to hide the glow. "What are you doing here?" My voice was sharper than I intended. Her gaze flicked to the pile of papers, then back to me. For a heartbeat, I was certain it was over, that my careful web had been torn apart by a single careless moment. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've seen him too," she said. "The things he hides, the way he changes reports. I know something's wrong. If you need help, I can cover for you." I stared at her, my pulse roaring in my ears. I had lived so long with only silence for company that her words hit me like a blow. "Why would you risk that?" I asked. She glanced down at her hands, twisting them nervously. "Because he makes me feel small every single day. And I'm tired of it. I think you are too." Her confession cracked something inside me. For the first time, I realized I was not entirely alone. From that night, Sarah became a thread woven into my plan. She was clever in her own quiet way. She carried coffee into the conference room, leaving the tray close enough for me to slip a file from David's desk. She would trip clumsy on purpose, papers scattering across the floor, giving me seconds to lift my phone and capture photos of documents before sliding them back into place. We never spoke much in public. A glance, a nod, a brush of the hand, as one passed a folder to the other. But beneath that still surface, a current of risk ran strong. One misstep, and we would both be crushed. There was one afternoon I remember clearly. David had left his office for a call, his desk cluttered with contracts. Sarah appeared at the door holding a stack of reports. She caught my eye, then deliberately let the top folder slip. Pages fanned out across the carpet. "Sorry," she exclaimed, dropping to her knees. I bent down too, and while the others looked on with mild annoyance, I slid my phone from my sleeve, snapping quick shots of the contract David had just signed. My heart pounded so hard I thought they might hear it. Then Sarah gathered the papers, handed them back, and the moment was over. That night, reviewing the photos, I found the proof, a clause removed, one that shielded the company from liability. Without it, the deal looked pristine, but it was a trap waiting to spring. I leaned back in my chair, the images glowing on the screen. Sarah's whispered words echoed in my mind. "I can cover for you." I wasn't fighting in silence anymore. They thought I would always sit in the shadows, harmless and mute. But each page, each photograph was a note in a song of reckoning. And now there were two of us writing it. We were silent, but together we were composing the kind of silence that could shatter glass. I once believed the office was the cruelest battlefield where David always lurked, waiting for his chance to humiliate me. But I was wrong. The family dining room, lit with soft candlelight and echoing with polite laughter, proved to be a stage far more merciless. That evening we gathered in the grand dining hall of my parents' house. The table stretched long, draped in crisp white linen, the silverware gleaming as though it had never been touched. Crystal glasses caught the light from the chandelier, casting tiny prisms across the walls. David sat at the center, shoulders squared in his tailored suit, fresh from work. He spoke as though he had just returned from conquering kingdoms. "The negotiations in Chicago," he declared, raising his glass, closed faster than expected. "It's another milestone for Donovan Industries." Laughter rippled around the table and glasses clinked in celebration. My uncles leaned in, their admiration flowing freely. My aunts smiled with pride, their eyes glowing. I stayed quiet. The knife moved across my plate with precise strokes, cutting the meat into pieces so small they looked like fragments of something broken. My presence felt like a stain on the perfect portrait they were painting of David. Then, as the laughter waned, I felt the shift. Eyes began to turn toward me, one after the other, until their weight pressed on my shoulders. "Claire," my aunt spoke up, her voice sugar-coated but sharp beneath. "What is it you do again? Assistant, wasn't it? Or are you still buried in those little paperwork tasks?" The question hung in the air like smoke. David leaned back, a smirk tugging at his lips. "She's been in a few meetings," he added lightly. "Mostly just to observe, of course. She's not quite ready to handle a project on her own." The laughter that followed was softer, almost polite, like porcelain shattering behind closed doors. But each sound still cut deep, as if sharp edges were scattered across the table. I lowered my gaze, pretending to focus on the food, but all I could see were their glances, some dismissive, some amused, some pitying. I wanted to vanish into the high-backed chair, to fold into the shadows and escape the weight of their judgment. David raised his glass again. "But we're proud of her, aren't we? She's learning. Slowly, but she's learning." Another round of chuckles circled the table. My throat tightened. Each word was meant to remind them and me that I was nothing more than the shadow trailing his brilliance. Just as my chest threatened to cave, I caught the smallest movement. My mother, seated at the far end, placed her spoon down gently. Her eyes flicked toward me for only a heartbeat. Then her fingers brushed the edge of her scarf, a gesture so subtle it could have been missed. Her lips barely moved as she whispered low enough for only me to hear. "Be patient." No one else noticed. The others carried on, oblivious, their laughter like glass shards scattered across polished wood. But I heard her, and it steadied something inside me, like a hand holding mine in secret. The meal dragged on, course after course, the celebration of David's triumphs never ending. I smiled faintly when spoken to. I nodded when required. I lifted my glass when toasts were made. Outwardly, I played the part they assigned me, silent, insignificant. But inside, I was memorizing every sound, every sneer, every line of dialogue in the cruel play unfolding around me. When the final toast rang out, the family raised their glasses high, the chandelier casting golden fire over their faces. They celebrated David, their golden son, their victor. I stayed still, my glass untouched. My hand slipped beneath the table to brush against the black notebook hidden in my bag, the leather warm under my palm. It was the place where every slight, every humiliation had already been carved into permanence. In the quiet of my heart, I made a vow. One day, there would be another dinner, another gathering under lights just as bright, with eyes just as eager. And on that day, the name they lifted their glasses to would not be David's. It would be mine. After that family dinner, I thought I had grown used to humiliation. but nothing compared to the cruelty that lived within the walls of Donovan Industries. At home, I could escape to silence. Here, under the sterile lights of the office, there was no escape. David wasn't just my brother in this place, he was my boss. And he wielded that power like a weapon, sharpening it against me at every turn. The morning heat pressed in through the glass windows, making the air heavy. I had barely settled into my desk when David's footsteps echoed down the hallway, fast-clipped, purposeful. He carried a stack of documents so thick it looked like a weapon in itself. Without a word, he dropped it on my desk. The thud rattled the cup of coffee at my side, sending ripples across the dark surface. "Claire," he said, his voice cool and commanding, "you'll redraft this contract. Don't ask questions. Just do it. And it better be done by 5. Or else you know what that means." The words fell flat but heavy, and though he didn't raise his voice, every head in the room seemed to turn slightly, just enough to catch the tension between us. I kept my eyes low as I flipped through the pages, careful not to betray the storm rising inside me. Numbers stared back at me, figures that ballooned without explanation. Expenses tucked into vague categories. Signatures that looked hastily forged. This wasn't carelessness. It was deliberate. Every detail whispered fraud. I felt the air around me tighten. If I followed his order, I would be complicit, tangled in the same corruption that he thought no one could see. But if I refused, if I dared to speak against him, I knew exactly what would happen. David would turn me into an example. He would shame me, humiliate me in front of every employee within earshot, just as he had before. He leaned closer, his eyes narrowing like the point of a blade. "Keep quiet," he murmured, his tone laced with warning. "And get it done." The room around us buzzed faintly with phones ringing, keyboards clacking, but it all felt distant. My pulse hammered in my ears. My hands trembled as I held the papers, but I forced my face into calm, into compliance. I nodded once. "Of course," I said. David smirked, satisfied, and walked away. His shoes clicked against the polished floor, fading as he disappeared into his office. The moment the door closed behind him, I exhaled, my chest burning from holding it in. I slid the papers closer, opening my drawer with steady hands, though my palms were slick with sweat. From my bag, I retrieved a small USB drive no larger than my thumb. I slipped it into the port of my computer, heart pounding as though the sound itself might betray me. Line by line, page by page, I copied the entire file. Every manipulated number, every doctored signature, every deceitful clause. The progress bar on the screen crawled forward, and I glanced over my shoulder with every passing second, certain someone would appear. Sarah walked past, carrying a stack of files, and I froze until she disappeared around the corner. A bead of sweat slid down my temple. Finally, the transfer finished. I yanked the USB free, slid it into the lining of my jacket pocket, and smoothed the papers back into place as though nothing had happened. My hands shook as I closed the folder, but beneath the fear, something stronger flared. For weeks I had been gathering fragments, whispers, documents, stray emails. But this was different. This was undeniable. Not just scraps. Not just suspicions. Evidence. I pressed my palm against the pocket where the USB hid the plastic, warm against my skin. The weight of it was almost unbearable heavy, not because of size, but because of what it represented. This was no longer about silence. This was no longer about endurance. It was a weapon, and it was mine. The rest of the day blurred. David swept past my desk more than once, throwing sharp looks, as if to remind me of my deadline. I kept my expression neutral, hands busy, eyes lowered. Let him believe I was still the obedient shadow he thought I was. But beneath the quiet tapping of keys, beneath the rustle of papers, I felt the shift. For the first time, I wasn't just enduring his cruelty. I was preparing for the moment I would turn it back on him. By the time the office lights dimmed and the last of the staff trickled out, I sat alone, staring at the glow of my computer screen. My reflection stared back, faint against the glass. Not the invisible assistant. Not the fragile little sister. Someone else. Someone ready. I stood gathering my things, my jacket draped carefully over my arm so the USB wouldn't slip. The building was silent now, every sound amplified the hum of the lights. the echo of my heels against the tile, the steady rhythm of my breath. David thought I would carry his sins, shield his empire, and remain silent forever. But tonight, I had taken something he couldn't afford to lose. And when the time came, it would bring the Donovan empire crashing down. They say company parties are meant for networking, for celebrating success. But to me, they feel like battlegrounds, every step a test, every glance a weapon that could slice into whatever pride I had left. I knew the gala wasn't just a party, it was another stage David would use to strip me down. A week before the event, the communications department circulated the announcement all employees were expected to arrive in formal attire in line with Donovan Industries' professional image. The email had barely landed when whispers and laughter spread through the office. Behind me, a voice carried light but deliberate. Claire doesn't have to worry. No matter what she wears, she'll still look ordinary. The group laughed softly, pretending to hide it, but their eyes flicked toward me. I kept my back straight, pretending not to hear, but my ears burned. Around the corner in the common area, they discussed designer dresses, jeweled heels, and exclusive brands as if they were planning for the Oscars. David's voice cut through low and mocking. He didn't miss his chance. He strolled past, eyes scanning me from head to toe, his smile a thin line of contempt. I hope you're not thinking of showing up in one of those cheap office outfits. We can't have the company looking unprofessional in front of our partners. The word hung in the air sharper because he had said it before a brand he wanted burned into me. The others chuckled, covering their mouths, and I felt the blood surge to my face. I clenched my fists beneath the desk nails, pressing into my palms, grounding me against the urge to cry or lash out. I didn't answer. I couldn't afford to. But inside I felt the old fire rising again. I had nothing like their money. I couldn't buy $1,000 dress just to wear for a single evening. But neither could I allow myself to become their entertainment, their punchline. Later that afternoon, I stepped into the break room to pour coffee. The hum of the vending machine filled the silence until two women from marketing slipped in behind me. They didn't see me at first. "Did you hear?" one whispered, her voice tinged with excitement. "Mr. Mitchell is bringing partners from the West Coast. It's going to be huge." "Everyone's saying David is using the gala to show off his leadership." The other laughed, sharp and dismissive. "And Claire, I bet she'll come in something from a department store. Poor thing, David will eat her alive in front of them." Their laughter pricked at me more than the hot coffee I nearly spilled. I froze in place, cup halfway to my lips, their words sinking like stones in my stomach. When I finally turned, they caught sight of me. Their faces flushed a quick exchange of guilty glances, then they rushed past with mumbled excuses. I stood there, gripping the cup, feeling the heat seep through the paper into my palm. They thought I couldn't hear. They thought I wouldn't fight back. But their whispers only confirmed what I already knew: the gala would not be a celebration. It would be a trial, and David intended for me to fail in front of everyone who mattered. That night, after leaving the office, I walked through downtown, the streets glowing with neon and street lamps. Every boutique I passed displayed gowns shimmering under perfect light, their price tags like walls meant to keep people like me out. I pressed my hand against the cool glass of one display, staring at a dress so elegant it looked untouchable, knowing it was never mine to claim. But then, at the corner of a quiet street, I noticed a small shop. Its window wasn't lit with grandeur, just a soft light spilling over a single dress. Black. Simple. Timeless. I stepped inside. The store smelled faintly of cedar and lavender. A woman approached, her eyes. Kind, her smile without judgment. She touched the fabric of the dress and said gently, "It's not flashy, but it will fit you well. And sometimes confidence is better than sequins." Her words lodged in me like a promise. I pulled out the money I had saved for months, a handful of bills that felt far too heavy to part with. Still, I handed them over. In the fitting room, I slipped into the dress. The fabric hugged me, neither too loose nor too tight, but perfectly right, as though it had been waiting for me. I stared at my reflection. Gone was the invisible assistant, the shadow in Donovan's empire. In the mirror stood a woman who might not shine like diamonds, but who carried something else: resolve. For a moment, I let my fingers trace the neckline, imagining the chandeliers of the gala, the sneers, the laughter. My chest tightened, but I stood straighter, lifting my chin. I folded the dress carefully into the bag the shopkeeper gave me, carrying it close to my chest as I stepped back into the night. The city lights seemed different, less distant, more like sparks flickering in the darkness. I knew what awaited me at the gala. I knew David would make his move in front of everyone, that the humiliation would not stop with whispers and passing comments. He would drag me into the spotlight, force me to bend beneath his power. But I also knew I would not bend so easily this time. I walked home, the dress pressed against me, a shield and a reminder. They thought I would show up small, laughable, invisible. But I would arrive prepared, not dazzling, not grand, but unshaken. The battle wasn't over. It was only shifting. And under the chandeliers, they would finally see that what they called unprofessional might prove stronger than anything money could buy. The gala night of Donovan Industries glowed with opulence. Scarlet drapes cascaded from the ceiling, golden tablecloths shimmered under the soft glow, and the chandelier, grand, crystalline, ruthless, hung above like 1,000 eyes watching every movement. Laughter rippled across the ballroom, champagne flutes chimed, and silk dresses brushed against polished shoes. On the surface, it was an evening of triumph. But for me, stepping into that hall was like walking straight into an ambush. I adjusted the strap of my simple black dress, the one I had bought, with every last bit of my savings. It wasn't designer, it wasn't extravagant, but it fit me like armor, plain yet dignified. Still, as I crossed the room, I could feel eyes sliding off me as if I were invisible, a shadow unworthy of being noticed. David saw me instantly. He stood near the stage, his tuxedo cut to perfection, his posture radiating confidence as if the entire empire rested on his shoulders. His eyes locked on me and his lips curled into that familiar smile, half mockery, half warning. I knew what was coming. The evening went on. Music floated in the background, a string quartet bowing with elegance. Executives toasted partners, exchanged pleasantries, and David moved from group to group, shaking hands, laughing loudly, owning every conversation. He was in his element. I stayed to the side, sipping water, silently observing. My chest tightened, each laugh from him like a nail hammered deeper into my ribs. Then it happened. Claire. His voice boomed, slicing through the clatter of glasses and chatter. The crowd stilled. My heart thudded. He raised his glass high, smiling like a gracious host. "Come over here." The chandelier's light caught the rim of his glass, throwing a cruel sparkle across his face. Reluctantly, I stepped forward, my heels clicking against the marble floor. David spread his arm as if presenting me to royalty. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "this is my sister, my dear Claire. She is, how should I put it, a shining example of the gap between professional excellence and, well, something less." A ripple of laughter swept the room, not loud, but sharp enough to sting. My breath caught. He wasn't finished. While we're out here signing multi-million-dollar deals, Claire is still struggling with spreadsheets. Numbers formulas, small mistakes, things she's very talented at creating. The crowd chuckled, some covering their mouths with champagne flutes, others not bothering to hide their amusement. My vision blurred for a second, heat rising to my cheeks, my palms slick with sweat. My ears rang as though the chandelier itself was mocking me with its glittering silence. I wanted to vanish, to melt into the marble floor and escape every pair of eyes drilling into me. But I forced myself to stand taller, my lips pressed into a thin line. I swallowed the humiliation, whole bitter as it was, and let it burn inside me like fuel. David lifted his glass higher. "But let's celebrate her presence anyway. It's not every day she makes it to a party, right?" The laughter grew. My humiliation had become their entertainment. I scanned the crowd. Some faces were gleeful, others awkward, some pitying. None came to my defense. At that moment, I wasn't Claire Donovan, part of the family empire. I was a joke. David clinked glasses with an executive, his grin stretching wider, basking in the applause of cruelty. My chest heaved, but I stayed silent. Every word, every laugh I carved into memory, etching it deeper than ink. The chandelier above blazed like a crown of fire, illuminating the predator's smile on my brother's face. I clenched my fists at my side nails, biting into my palm until it hurt. The pain grounded me, reminding me I was still standing. Then, as the crowd's laughter echoed under the chandelier, a thought crystallized. This was not the end of the night. I didn't need to fight back here. Not yet. Because sometimes silence is sharper than any blade. The room roared around me, but in my head there was only stillness. I watched David bask in his own triumph, and beneath the humiliation, a seed of certainty began to bloom. This moment, his laughter, their mockery would not be forgotten. It would be remembered. And one day soon it would be avenged. As I stepped back into the shadows of the ballroom, my eyes lifted to the chandelier. Its brilliance didn't blind me anymore. Instead, I saw it for what it was, fragile glass waiting for the right weight to shatter. They thought I had crumbled. They thought I was finished. But under that chandelier and the glare of their laughter, something inside me hardened into resolve. And none of them, not David, not this empire, were ready for what would come next. The sound of laughter still clung to the crystal chandelier, bright and merciless. My cheeks burned, but I stood motionless in the middle of that golden hall, the faint taste of humiliation still on my tongue. David's glass was lifted high, his grin wide as if the whole world had just confirmed his dominance. For one split second, I thought this was where I would shatter. Yet something shifted in the air. The crowd's laughter faltered, replaced by an expectant hush, as footsteps echoed across the polished floor. A tall man emerged from the circle of guests, his black tailored suit cutting through the sea of gowns and tuxedos. His hair was silver at the temples, his stride calm but commanding. Whispers rippled. Everyone knew him. Mr. Charles Mitchell, senior executive, the chairman's most trusted confidant. Where David was brash and loud, Mitchell was deliberate, a man whose presence turned conversations into silence. I felt my stomach tighten. This was no coincidence. He had come for a reason. David straightened his jacket, still riding the wave of his supposed victory. He forced a laugh loud enough to reclaim the attention. "Mr. Mitchell," he said, voice coated with sugar, "allow me to introduce my sister. She's still learning the ropes of professionalism. We're working on it." The guests chuckled softly, eager to align themselves with David's derision. It was his old trick, make me the punchline to keep his own image untouchable. But Mitchell did not glance at David, his eyes sharp and unwavering, fixed on me. He extended his hand. My breath caught. Around us, the laughter died instantly, as if a switch had been flipped. I stared at his hand, my own trembling slightly before I placed it in his. His grip was firm, steady, grounding me when the floor felt ready to collapse beneath me. "Are you the woman the chairman showed me in the photograph?" His voice carried across the room, unhurried, every word deliberate. Gasps broke the silence. My brother froze. The smug curve of his lips slipped into a hard line. His hand holding the wine glass trembled just enough for the liquid to ripple against the crystal. The photograph. My mind raced. The chairman had sent my picture to Mitchell. He had spoken of me. My role was supposed to remain invisible until the time was right. But here, under the chandelier's cruel glow, the truth began to surface, and not by my hand. David's face paled. That's not relevant." He stammered, his voice suddenly thin. "Mitchell, she's just an assistant. She doesn't—" Mitchell's gaze cut him down with a single glance. Then he turned back to me. "The chairman asked me to assist you in leading the internal audit and restructuring of Donovan Enterprises. I have been waiting for this meeting." His words rang like steel, each syllable slicing through the thick air. Murmurs surged like waves. Guests craned their necks, whispering behind manicured hands. Some of David's closest allies exchanged wary glances. The ground beneath my brother's empire trembled, and everyone could feel it. For a moment I could see David fighting for air, his jaw clenched, his voice clawing for control. This must be a mistake," he sputtered, desperate to salvage his standing. He looked at me, eyes blazing with hatred masked as disbelief. "Claire can't possibly. She doesn't have the experience, she doesn't." But the room no longer belonged to him. It had shifted, tilted spun out of his grasp. I saw a junior manager at the back, one who had smirked at my expense countless times, now staring at me with wide, uncertain eyes. I caught the faintest whisper from a pair of shareholders near the stage. "The chairman chose her," one muttered. "Then things are changing faster than we thought." Their words were not meant for me to hear, but they echoed nonetheless, proof that the tide had turned. I stood straighter, though my heart pounded like a drum. The humiliation David had just showered on me still clung to my skin, but beneath it something else ignited a new strength, as if my own silence had been waiting for this moment to rise. Mitchell released my hand at last, but his presence remained like a shield at my side. He raised his glass not to David, but to me. "Here's to the future," he said simply. No one laughed. No one dared. A few hesitant clinks followed, forced and awkward, while David stood frozen in the spotlight he had once commanded. His empire of arrogance cracked before my very eyes, not with a thunderous collapse, but with a quiet, undeniable shift of power. The chandelier sparkled above, casting its fractured light across the hall. Once its brilliance had exposed my shame. Tonight it bore witness to something entirely different. My brother had thought he could use me as his stage prop, a reminder to the world of his superiority. But with one handshake the script flipped, and the audience saw him falter for the first time. I caught his stare across the room. Rage, disbelief, and a flicker of fear. For years he had defined me by my silence, my failures, my supposed lack of professionalism. But tonight, under the watchful eyes of everyone who mattered, he saw a truth he could no longer laugh away. The game board had shifted, and this time I was no longer a pawn. I was holding the piece that could bring down his entire kingdom. They thought my humiliation would be the climax of the night. They were wrong. This was only the beginning. After the gala, whispers traveled faster than I could have imagined. A single handshake had been enough to shatter the walls of arrogance David had built around himself for years, and I knew the cracks would never close again. The very next morning, Donovan Industries felt like a different place. The hallways, once filled with laughter at my expense, now buzzed with hushed voices. Each step I took echoed louder than before, and I caught glances that were no longer dripping with contempt but with something else: curiosity, maybe even fear. One man who had never acknowledged me gave me a short nod. A woman who once smirked openly when David mocked me quickly turned away when I met her eyes. It was subtle, but I could feel it. Something was shifting. By mid-morning, I noticed it more clearly. In the break room, two junior associates paused their conversation when I entered, their voices dropping to whispers. I caught fragments. Chairman's orders, audit, Claire Donovan. When they realized I could hear, they scrambled out, leaving their coffee untouched. In the past, they would have laughed in my face. Now they treated me like someone holding secrets too dangerous to cross. And then David stormed in. His footsteps were heavy, his face flushed with rage. He slammed his palm against the edge of a desk so hard the pens rattled in their holders. "No one is to listen to Claire," he barked, his voice quivering in a way that betrayed his desperation. "She has no authority here." In the past, such a command would have silenced the entire office, but this time there was hesitation. Heads did not immediately bow. A few glanced at each other before looking back at their screens. Hands continued to move across keyboards, though slower, more deliberate, as if everyone was waiting to see how far David would go. His voice, once sharp as steel, now rang hollow, trembling under its own weight. At the far corner, I saw Mr. Howard, one of the senior managers who had always sided with David, shift uncomfortably in his chair. He cleared his throat as if to speak, then stayed quiet. Even loyalty, I realized, had its limits when the ground began to shake beneath their feet. I stayed in my seat watching. Sarah leaned closer, her eyes fixed on the furious figure pacing the room. "He's losing control," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "This is your moment, Claire." She was right. For too long I had sat quietly, filling notebook after notebook, waiting. But now I had more than words. I had evidence. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue with David in front of the staff. Instead, I returned to my office, sat at my desk, and composed a brief report. Nothing dramatic, no accusations spelled out in anger. Just facts. Figures. Contracts David had forced me to process each one, flawed, inflated, or falsified. I compiled them into a neat packet and sent them directly to Mr. Mitchell, the man whose handshake had turned the tide at the gala. A quiet strike, sharp and clean. The hours that followed were filled with a strange tension. David disappeared into meetings, his office door slamming shut. Outside, the air was thick with rumors. People stole glances at me, unsure of what I might be capable of now. My hands moved steadily across the keyboard, but inside my chest, my heart pounded like a drum. By late afternoon, the summons came. David was called to an emergency session with the board. I watched him march down the corridor, shoulders squared, jaw clenched. His allies trailed behind him, their faces pale, whispering frantically. It looked less like a leader walking to a meeting and more like a man being led to judgment. When he returned, he was no longer the man who had walked in. His face was pale, his tie crooked, sweat glistening at his temples. He gripped his folder as though it were a lifeline, his knuckles white. He did not look at me. Not once. Not long after, two directors walked past my office. They spoke in hushed tones, but the glass walls carried their words just enough. "If Mitchell is backing her," one muttered, "David won't last another quarter." The other only sighed in agreement. I lowered my eyes back to my screen fingers, resuming their rhythm on the keys. To anyone watching, I seemed indifferent, as though his unraveling had nothing to do with me. But deep inside, I felt the balance tipping. For the first time, the power he had wielded so ruthlessly was slipping through his hands. David could shout louder bark orders until his throat went raw, but the more he raged, the more fragile he appeared. And I knew what he did not want to admit. When an empire begins to fracture from within, it does not take much to bring it crashing down. And his cracks were spreading faster every day. I had carried silence like a shield for years. It had been my way of surviving David's constant reminders that I was weak, unprofessional, unworthy of the Donovan name. But silence can only hold so much. That morning I knew it was time to let truth speak louder than humiliation. I arrived at my office before the sun fully climbed over the skyline. The halls were still, the air tinged with the faint scent of disinfectant. My fingers flew across the keyboard, steady and deliberate. Line by line, the final report came together. Fraud hidden in polished numbers. Contracts altered with deliberate precision. Emails forged to make the impossible look like success. Every piece I had gathered, every note, every stolen photograph threaded into a chain no one could break. But the report alone wasn't enough. David had always been skilled at twisting words, charming board members, shifting blame. This time I needed proof no one could deny. Sarah's recording was that proof. His voice cold and commanding, telling a junior accountant to falsify figures to shove blame downward if anyone noticed. The arrogance in his tone was sharper than any blade. By noon I pressed send. The report and recording flew across the company's secure server, landing in the inboxes of every board member. My chest heaved as I leaned back in my chair. The silence that followed felt enormous, irreversible. There was no turning back. It didn't take long for the storm to come. David's footsteps thundered down the hallway before he even reached my door. The handle slammed against the wall as he burst inside. His tie hung crooked, his face flushed a furious red. "You think this little stunt will destroy me?" His voice was a snarl, raw and sharp. "Do you really believe you can erase me with some doctored files? If I go down, I'll drag you with me. Every contract has your name on it, too. I'll make them believe it was you." I closed my laptop with deliberate calm. My pulse was racing, but I refused to let it show. "Then you should hear yourself first," I said. I tapped the speaker button. His own voice filled the office, clear and merciless. "Don't ask questions. Just make the numbers look good. If there's trouble, blame the junior staff." The sound of it reverberated off the glass walls. David froze. His lips parted, but no words followed. His fists clenched so tight his knuckles turned white, but his rage couldn't drown out the echo of his own betrayal. For the first time in years, he had no weapon left to use. When he stormed out the door, rattled behind him. but I knew he wasn't retreating. He was preparing for the real battle. That afternoon, an emergency meeting was called. I walked to the boardroom with my notes in hand, my footsteps measured. The room was packed, the weight of tension almost suffocating. Executives shifted in their seats, their expressions tight. The large screen at the end of the table glowed, waiting. David sat at the head, his posture still rigid, but the sheen of sweat on his temples betrayed him. For years he had owned this room, commanding it with a smile or a sneer. But today the room did not belong to him. The chairman nodded for the presentation to begin. One by one the files appeared on the screen. Inflated projections, altered contracts, payments routed through shell accounts. And then finally, Sarah's recording. David's voice filled the air, unshakable, undeniable. A heavy silence followed, the kind that crushes even the strongest defenses. David pushed back from the table, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. "This is fabricated," his voice cracked. "She's lying. She's jealous. She wants what I've built." One board member leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "Then you deny this voice is yours." David's mouth opened, then closed again. His silence was louder than any denial. His shoulders sagged, his tie hung limp against his shirt. I watched him struggle, flailing against the inevitable. I remembered the times he had laughed at me in this very room, cutting my voice down before it could rise. The irony wasn't lost on me. Today his own voice condemned him. My pen tapped softly against my notebook, the same one that had once been filled with humiliations. Now it was filled with evidence. The balance had shifted. David's eyes burned into me across the table, filled with fury and disbelief. "Claire," he spat, his voice hoarse, "after everything I gave you," I met his gaze evenly. "You didn't give me anything. You took my dignity, my respect, this family's trust, and you thought no one would ever stop you." The chairman's gavel struck once sharp and final. "This board finds sufficient evidence of misconduct. Effective immediately. David Donovan is suspended pending legal review." The words rang like a verdict in a courtroom. David collapsed back into his chair. His face was gray, his eyes hollow. The man who once strutted through these halls like a king now looked like a ghost of himself, stripped of the crown he had clung to so tightly. I gathered my folder, stood, and walked out of the boardroom. Behind me, voices rose in hushed tones, but I didn't turn back. I didn't need to. The truth was already louder than anything David could scream. As the heavy doors closed, I drew a breath that felt like the first in years. The silence that had once chained me was gone. In its place was something stronger. The reckoning had begun. I always believed that when this day came, I would feel triumph in its purest form. I imagined raising a glass, letting laughter spill from my lips as I watched my brother collapse beneath the weight of his own arrogance. But sitting in the boardroom, the air so heavy it pressed against my ribs, I felt something different. This was no simple victory. This was the collapse of a dynasty. The meeting had been called in haste, but the room looked prepared for a trial. The board members sat in a long arc, their expressions couched from stone. The long mahogany table gleamed under the recessed lights, but even its polish could not soften the tension. Papers lay open in front of them, my report printed in neat stacks. The screen at the far end flickered with lines of fraudulent numbers, falsified contracts, and the recording Sarah had risked so much to capture. David sat at the head of the table, but his usual command of the room was gone. He fidgeted with his tie tugged at his cuffs. When the recording played again, his voice was sharp and dismissive. "Don't ask questions. Just make the numbers look good. If there's trouble, blame it on the junior staff." The words seemed to brand themselves into the silence. A cough broke from one of the directors. Another shifted in his seat, the sound of fabric brushing loud in the stillness. Then the chairman, his silver hair catching the light, leaned forward. His voice was low but carried the weight of judgment. "Miss Donovan, do you deny that this voice is yours?" For a heartbeat. David seemed ready to argue. His lips parted, his jaw clenched. But nothing came. Beads of sweat gathered on his forehead, sliding down his temple. His silence filled the room louder than any denial could. I could see the shift then, subtle but unmistakable. Mr. Lansing, one of David's strongest allies, closed his folder and set his pen down deliberately as if declaring his loyalty withdrawn. Mrs. Chen, who had always laughed the loudest at David's jokes, leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing with cold disdain. They were abandoning him one by one, and he could feel it. Finally he snapped. He slammed his palm against the polished table, his voice cracking with desperation. "This is a conspiracy. My sister has always been jealous. She wants what is mine. You're all blind if you believe her lies." His words rang hollow, bouncing against walls that no longer absorbed his authority. Several members exchanged glances, but none came to his defense. Their silence was sharper than any accusation. Then his eyes swung to me, burning with fury, veins rising in his neck. "Claire," he spat, "how dare you? After everything I gave you, the job, the Donovan name, the chance to sit in this room, you repay me with betrayal." I steadied myself, my voice calm, carrying across the table. "You never gave me anything, David. You stripped me of respect. You turned my name into a weapon against me. You forced me to carry your lies, your corruption, while you basked in their praise. And you thought I would never speak." The words cut through the air. A silence followed, deeper than before, every gaze fixed on David as though the room itself had turned against him. His mouth worked soundlessly, his face blotched with rage and humiliation. The chairman raised the gavel in his hand. His expression did not waver. After full review of the evidence, he declared, his voice like iron, "This board has reached a unanimous decision. Effective immediately, David Donovan is removed from his position as Chief Executive Officer. All managerial powers are revoked. Furthermore, the evidence of misconduct will be delivered to the proper legal authorities." The gavel struck down with a single thunderous crack. For a moment, no one breathed. Then the weight of the words seemed to crush David into his chair. His shoulders sagged, his chest heaving. The once pristine tie hung crooked around his neck, his suit wrinkled as though it too had surrendered. He raised a trembling hand to his face, covering half of it, as if hiding from the stares now piercing him from every angle. Around the table, chairs shifted. Papers were gathered. The board members rose one by one, their movements steady but cold, leaving him to his silence. No one offered him comfort. No one lingered. They filed out like jurors leaving after a verdict, their judgment final. I gathered my own folder, sliding the pen into its place with deliberate care. The scrape of my chair against the floor echoed harshly. I stood my back straight and turned toward the door. Behind me, the sound broke. A raw, guttural cry burst from David's throat, a sound I had never heard from him before. It was not anger alone, nor sorrow alone, but a hollow mix of both wild and broken. The cry of a man stripped of everything he thought he owned. It reverberated through the high ceiling, jagged and desperate, until it seemed to dissolve into nothing. I did not look back. My steps carried me forward, each one steady, each one deliberate. The heavy doors loomed ahead, their brass handles gleaming under the light. I pushed them open, their weight groaning, then let them swing shut behind me with a final resonant thud. The sound echoed like the closing of a tomb. In that instant I knew. The reign of David Donovan was finished. The predator, who had once ruled this empire through fear and humiliation, was gone, replaced by the hollow shell of a man who had built his throne on lies. And as I walked away from the wreckage, my heart steady, my head unbowed, I knew something else as well. What came next was no longer his. It was mine to claim. They say when one door closes, another one opens. For me, it was not just a door. It was a whole new road glowing under the first light of dawn. A road I had carved with humiliation, with tears shed in silence, and with years of waiting when everyone thought I was too weak to fight back. Weeks after that boardroom judgment, I returned to Donovan Industries. But I was no longer the shadow that people overlooked, or the woman shoved aside with a mocking laugh. On the polished glass door of my new office, the letters were engraved clear and undeniable. Claire Donovan, Chief Strategy Officer. The building felt different when I walked through it. Colleagues who once whispered behind my back now stumbled to greet me. Some nodded awkwardly, as though their belated politeness could erase the years they joined the chorus of silence. Others avoided my eyes altogether, afraid I remembered every smirk, every whispered insult. And I did remember. But I did not need their approval anymore. I had claimed my own. Yet there were nights when I sat alone in that wide office staring at the city lights stretching beyond the windows, and I wondered if I had gone too far. I would think of David's face when the verdict fell, the way he collapsed in on himself like a building with no foundation. Was I cruel to feel no pity? But then the memories sharpened like broken glass. His voice cut me down in the conference room. His laughter echoed at the family table. His hand shoving fraudulent contracts into mine. This was never about cruelty. This was justice. The news spread across town faster than I ever imagined. The Donovan name no longer appeared in the finance columns as a beacon of strength. Instead, it was dragged through headlines of fraud investigations and legal hearings. My brother, once untouchable, was now a fallen man, his legacy reduced to scandal. Inside my office, I hung two things on the wall. The first was my black leather notebook, where my trembling hand had once scrawled each insult, each wound. Those pages no longer felt like scars. They were testimony proof that I had endured. The second was a framed photograph of my mother. Her quiet eyes held mine, and I could almost hear her whisper from that dinner table long ago. Be patient, Claire. Those two reminders became my compass. They told me that even in suffocating darkness, a single spark could light the way. One afternoon, as I was staring at the photograph, a knock sounded on the door. Come in, I said. The door opened and Sarah stepped inside, her eyes shining with something I had rarely seen in this place. Hope. She carried 2 cups of coffee, her smile soft and sure. Congratulations, Claire, she said as she placed 1 cup on my desk. I know you will change this place. I believe in you. I met her gaze, and for the first time in years, a genuine smile came easily. Not alone, Sarah, I answered. Not anymore. The empire that David once ruled with fear had collapsed. In its place, something fragile but real was being built. Not a kingdom of intimidation, but a workplace where voices could finally be heard. And as I sat back in my chair, I felt the weight of the past fall away. I was once the girl dismissed as unprofessional, laughed at under the chandeliers, silenced in rooms where I should have had a seat. I had swallowed humiliation until it nearly crushed me. But today, I walked into my new role with my head high. This was not an ending. This was a beginning. If you have ever been underestimated, if you have ever been pushed aside or silenced, remember this. Silence can turn into a weapon, and from the deepest darkness, light can be born. My story has reached its close, but yours may still be unfolding. If you too are fighting for your justice, share your story.